In the final days of World War II, one American general sat across a table from his defeated enemies and offered them something no one in history had ever dared to offer a vanquished army. Not mercy, not imprisonment, a choice. One that could restart the entire war. It's May 1945. Germany has surrendered. The guns have gone quiet across Europe for the first time in 6 years. Millions of soldiers are laying down their weapons, turning themselves in, waiting for whatever comes next. But General George S. Patton, the most feared, most controversial, most brilliant battlefield commander the Americans had, isn't celebrating. He's furious. And what he's about to do will be covered up, buried, and kept out of most history books for decades. If you're the kind of person who likes stories that go deeper than the textbook version, make sure you subscribe, because what happens at the end of this video is something even most history enthusiasts have never heard. To understand what Patton was thinking in May 1945, you have to understand what he was seeing. While the rest of the Allied world was popping champagne, Patton was staring at maps. And those maps told a story that terrified him. The Soviet Red Army, America's wartime ally, had swept across Eastern Europe like a tidal wave. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. Country after country falling under Stalin's shadow. And they weren't leaving. Patton had been watching this for months. He'd written in his diary, and these are his actual words, "We have defeated the wrong enemy." He believed the real threat to Western civilization wasn't Nazi Germany. It was Soviet communism. And he believed the moment to stop it was right now, while American armies were still armed, still positioned, still battle-hardened and ready. But that's not even the most shocking part. What most people don't know is what Patton did next. In the chaos immediately following Germany's surrender, something extraordinary was happening in Bavaria. Thousands of German Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS, not fanatics but regular army officers and enlisted men, were streaming westward. Not surrendering to the Soviets. Deliberately surrendering to the Americans. They knew the difference. Soviet captivity meant slave labor, starvation, possibly death. American captivity meant POW camps, Red Cross packages, and a chance of going home someday. But Patton saw something else in these men. He saw an army. A broken one, yes. A defeated one, certainly. But experienced, organized, disciplined, and potentially willing. Willing to do what? That's exactly what those Wehrmacht officers were about to find out, because Patton had requested a meeting. The exact details of what happened in those meetings have been pieced together from diaries, declassified military records, post-war testimonies, and accounts from Patton's own staff officers. What emerges is one of the most jaw-dropping moments of the entire 20th century. Patton sat across from senior German officers, men who had spent 6 years fighting the Americans, and he reportedly laid out a proposition so audacious, so reckless, so completely outside the bounds of what any general was supposed to say, that the officers in the room thought they'd misunderstood the translation. He wanted to know if they would fight again. Not for Hitler. Not for Nazism. That was finished. Patton despised the Nazi ideology as much as anyone. He wanted to know if they would fight the Soviets alongside the Americans. Now pause for a moment and let that land. The war has been over for days. The peace treaties are being drafted. The Nuremberg trials are being organized. The world is exhaling after the most destructive conflict in human history, and George Patton is sitting in a room in Bavaria, asking Wehrmacht officers if they want to switch sides and march east. But what happened next shocked everyone, because the German officers didn't laugh. They didn't refuse. They didn't storm out of the room. They said yes. According to accounts from Patton's staff, including his aide Colonel Charles Codman, and details later corroborated by historians like Carlo D'Este in his definitive Patton biography, the Germans weren't just willing, some were eager. They had their own reasons. Many of these officers had spent years on the Eastern Front. They had fought the Red Army in conditions that Americans could barely imagine. Brutal winters, no supplies, human wave attacks, total warfare with no rules. They had watched villages burned, civilians massacred, soldiers executed on the spot. They didn't need convincing that Stalin was dangerous. What they needed was someone to tell them it was possible. And Patton, reckless, visionary, combustible Patton, was telling them exactly that. But there was a problem. A massive one. And it wasn't just coming from the Germans. Word was getting back to Supreme Allied headquarters. Eisenhower, Patton's boss, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, was already dealing with Patton's enormous political headaches. Patton had slapped a soldier suffering from shell shock in 1943 and nearly ended his own career. He'd made unauthorized advances that disrupted Allied plans. He was brilliant, yes. But he was also, as one general put it, A magnificent fighting animal who needs to be kept on a very short leash. And now this. The implications were staggering. If Patton was seriously proposing to rearm German soldiers and drive east even informally, even in exploratory conversations, it could shatter the entire Allied coalition. The Soviets were still technically American allies. The peace was still being negotiated that if Stalin found out that American generals were talking to Wehrmacht officers about fighting him, the Cold War might not have started cold. That here's what most history books gloss over. Patton wasn't alone in his thinking. Not entirely. Inside the corridors of Allied high command, there were others who shared his deep anxiety about Soviet expansion. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who had just been voted out of office, had privately expressed similar concerns. He'd even asked Allied commanders to explore a plan, codenamed Operation Unthinkable, which studied the possibility of using German forces against the Soviets. That plan was later declassified and confirmed to be real. So Patton wasn't a lone madman. He was a man whose instincts about the Soviet threat were, in many ways, historically correct. But instincts and policy are two very different things. And the choice those Wehrmacht officers had been given to potentially take up arms again, this time alongside their former enemies, was about to collide with the cold realities of post-war politics. Here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody talks about. The meetings, to whatever extent they included any explicit proposals, went nowhere. Not because the Wehrmacht officers refused. Not because Patton gave up. Because Patton was silenced. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. The official reason was a press conference in which he compared Nazi Party members to American Democrats and Republicans, essentially suggesting that the political structure shouldn't be dismantled too aggressively during denazification. The public outrage was immediate. Eisenhower had no choice. Patton was removed from the command he had built into the most powerful armored force in American history. He was given a meaningless desk job, commanding a historical records division. George Patton commanding paperwork. He was furious, humiliated, and he made no secret of his intention to retire and go public, to give speeches, write books, tell the American people what he believed was really happening in Europe. He never got the chance. On December 9, 1945, just weeks after being relieved of command, Patton was riding in a staff car outside Mannheim, Germany, on his way to a pheasant hunt. A U.S. Army truck made a sudden left turn. The vehicles collided at low speed. Everyone else in the car was fine. Patton's head snapped forward and struck the partition. He suffered a fractured cervical vertebra. Paralyzed from the neck down, he lingered for 12 days in a military hospital, surrounded by his wife, his staff, the doctors. On December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton died of pulmonary edema and heart failure. He was 60 years old. And here is where the story becomes something stranger than fiction. In the decades since his death, questions have swirled around that accident. The truck driver gave inconsistent accounts. There were no witnesses who came forward independently. The vehicle was never fully examined. The accident occurred on a quiet Sunday morning on a road that should have been nearly empty. In 2008, a book by intelligence officer Douglas Bazata, who claimed to be a former OSS operative, alleged that Patton had been deliberately assassinated, that the low-speed crash had been staged, and that Patton had subsequently been poisoned in the hospital on orders from people who feared what he would say once he returned to America. Now historians debate this vigorously. There is no definitive proof. The assassination theory is considered speculative by mainstream scholarship. But it's worth noting, Bazata made his claims publicly with specificity, and they have never been fully disproved. What is not in dispute is this: the one man most likely to tell the American public the truth about the Soviet threat, the one man with the credibility, the fame, and the absolute fury to blow the lid off Allied post-war policy, died before he could say a word. So what happened to the Wehrmacht officers who had been given that impossible choice? Most of them went into POW camps. Processed, held, eventually released back into a Germany that barely existed anymore, a country divided, occupied, its cities in rubble. But here's the twist that closes the loop on everything. Within a decade, barely 10 years after those conversations in Bavaria, West Germany was rearmed. The Federal Republic of Germany joined NATO. German soldiers put on uniforms again, this time standing alongside Americans, pointing their weapons east. Exactly what Patton had proposed. Not immediately. Not recklessly. Not in the fire of 1945 with the blood barely dry. But eventually. Inevitably. The Cold War created the alliance Patton had envisioned, that he just wasn't alive to see it. General George S. Patton believed with every bone in his body that history moves in brutal, predictable rhythms. That power fills vacuums. That weakness invites catastrophe. That the moment to act is always now, before the window closes. He was right about the Soviet threat. He was right about the need for Western strength. And in his conversations with defeated Wehrmacht officers, he was in his unhinged, brilliant, impossible way pointing at the future. He just couldn't survive long enough to be proven right. The impossible choice he gave those German officers, fight again, or fade into history, was answered by history itself. They fought again. Just under a different flag, in a different war, with a different enemy wearing a different kind of uniform. And the man who first asked the question was buried in Luxembourg, in a military cemetery, surrounded by the soldiers of the Third Army he had led across Europe. He had asked for that. To be buried with his men. That much at least they let him have. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If Patton had lived, if he'd come home, gone on the lecture circuit, written his memoirs, gone public with everything he believed, would it have changed anything? Would America have been harder, faster, more decisive in confronting Soviet expansion? Or would history have unfolded exactly the same way, regardless of what one general said? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if this is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, the complicated, uncomfortable, deeply human history, then you know where to find more of it.